I had always kept my parking spot neat, a small corner of my driveway I called mine. But Karen, with her relentless arrogance, treated it like her personal lot. Day after day, she parked there, blocking me, smirking as if the rules didn't apply to her. I tried reasoning, but she laughed, claiming everyone can use any spot they want. That night, frustration boiled over. I decided to teach her a lesson she'd never forget. By morning, my quiet driveway had transformed into a tiny racetrack, complete with cones, ramps, and a surprise that would leave her SUV trapped and her ego shattered. The sun had barely peeked over the horizon, yet my mind was already racing. That little stretch of asphalt at the edge of my driveway, my parking spot, was supposed to be mine, a quiet, private piece of territory I had maintained for years. But it had become a daily battlefield. Karen, with her signature arrogance, had made it hers. Day after day, she would pull her massive SUV into my spot, leaving no space, no courtesy, and certainly no respect for anyone else. It wasn't just about a parking space anymore. It was about control, about ego, and about testing limits. I had tried everything to avoid confrontation. Notes politely taped to the windshield. Gentle verbal reminders. Even ignoring her audacious encroachments, hoping she would eventually get bored. But she never did. Each day her smirk grew wider, her gestures bolder. She acted as though the rules were only for everyone else, while she claimed exemption with her haughty laughter and self-assured air. Watching her strut down the sidewalk like she owned the street, I realized that reasoning would never work. Patience had run out. Even my neighbors, who usually kept to themselves, started noticing. Whispers of her entitlement traveled down the block. I could feel their eyes when I arrived home, seeing her parked in my space yet again. They were waiting to see my reaction, and frankly, so was I. This wasn't just a personal annoyance anymore. It was a spectacle, a challenge, and an opportunity. I had spent long enough on the defensive. It was time for a plan that would be impossible to ignore. As night fell, I began laying the groundwork. This wasn't about anger or revenge in a petty sense, it was about creativity, strategy, and precision. I measured the driveway, visualized every angle, and thought about every tool and object I could use. Cones, ramps, markers, and boundaries all played a part in my mental blueprint. By morning, my quiet, ordinary driveway would become a miniature racetrack, turning Karen's vehicle into a captive participant in my carefully orchestrated plan. Every decision was calculated. I considered her size, her usual parking style, and even her predictable behavior patterns. The placement of the cones needed to maximize confusion while ensuring her SUV couldn't escape easily. The ramps had to be functional but surprising, enough to make her realize she had underestimated the homeowner. My mind buzzed with possibilities, each more thrilling than the last. I felt a rush of satisfaction imagining her reaction, the shock, the disbelief, the growing frustration as her overconfidence met the consequences she never saw coming. By midnight, the driveway looked ordinary again, but my preparations were complete. Each object, each marker, each tiny obstruction was positioned perfectly. I had transformed my private spot into a silent trap, a puzzle disguised as a playground. Karen's SUV would have no idea what awaited her. And when morning arrived, it wouldn't just be a parking violation, it would be a lesson. An unforgettable statement about entitlement, ego, and consequences. Even in the quiet darkness, I could feel the weight of anticipation. This wasn't a petty act of revenge. It was strategic, artistic, and inevitable. Karen had taken my peace, my boundaries, and my patience. Now it was time for her to face the new rules of the street, designed by someone who refused to be pushed aside. Every detail mattered, from the placement of the ramps to the trajectory of the cones, because in this battle of wit and will, precision was everything. And then, just before the first hint of dawn, I paused to reflect. My heart raced with the thrill of what was about to unfold. This wasn't just about a parking spot. It was about reclaiming control, demonstrating ingenuity, and finally asserting that entitlement has consequences. I stepped back, observing my creation with a mix of pride and anticipation. By the time Karen returned, she would have no choice but to navigate the obstacle course I had prepared. Little did she know, every ramp, every cone, and every tiny corner had been designed specifically for her. When she drove into my mini racetrack, it wouldn't just be a parking mishap, it would be a statement, one she would never forget. And for the neighbors watching from behind their curtains, this was about to be the most entertaining morning of the year. Morning arrived slowly, with a soft golden glow stretching across the neighborhood. Birds fluttered between branches, unaware of the tension simmering beneath the calm suburban scene. I had been awake for hours, waiting inside near the window, sipping lukewarm coffee as adrenaline buzzed quietly beneath the surface. Everything was in place. The cones stood ready like silent soldiers. The ramps waited in their exact positions. My carefully plotted layout, innocent to the untrained eye, was poised to transform Karen's routine into unforgettable chaos. Her punctuality was predictable, almost mechanical. Every weekday morning, she left at nearly the same time, returning at nearly the same minute. It had become part of the rhythm of the block, the unpleasant punctuation mark in an otherwise peaceful schedule. So when I heard the barking growl of her SUV engine approaching from down the street, I didn't need to look. I felt the sound in my chest first, bold, impatient, entitled. Then I saw her. Karen's SUV rounded the corner with that familiar hasty turn, cutting the corner too tight like she always did. Her white blazer and bright pink pants made her look like she was heading to a photo shoot instead of another day of lecturing strangers about rules she herself refused to follow. She had that same confident tilt of the head, the same dismissive air, as though the entire neighborhood revolved around her convenience. She didn't slow down as she approached my driveway. She never did. In her mind, the space belonged to her now. She rolled right in, her SUV's tires bumping smoothly over the asphalt until they touched the first cone. The moment her front tire made contact, the cone slid out from under it and flipped against the bumper with a sharp, hollow thwack. She slammed her brakes. The SUV jerked forward violently, causing her sunglasses to slip down her nose. Confusion tightened her expression, and she leaned out of the window, staring at the cone like it had personally insulted her. She stepped out of the vehicle and immediately saw the rest of the setup. More cones. The angled ramps. The narrow outline of the track's borders. Her eyes widened as she slowly realized she had driven directly into an enclosed obstacle course. My obstacle course. Her confusion deepened into something sharper, a mixture of disbelief and rising indignation. She walked around the SUV in irritated circles, hands on her hips, muttering under her breath. She kicked one of the cones aside out of frustration, only to watch it roll directly into the path of her rear tire, blocking her from reversing without running it over. I watched her every move carefully, hidden just behind the blinds. Her breathing sped up as she surveyed the layout. She tugged at the ramp with her foot, only to realize her SUV couldn't cross it without scraping. She tried pushing the cones aside, but each one led her deeper into the winding layout. And when she attempted to reverse, the positioning left her wheel locked in a narrow angle, making every movement more difficult. This was exactly how it was designed, not dangerous, not destructive, but infuriatingly precise. She climbed back into her SUV and tried again. She turned the steering wheel sharply, then eased off the brake, attempting to maneuver through the tight squeeze. But with every adjustment, the SUV only wedged itself more awkwardly within the track. She honked, long, angry blasts cutting through the quiet morning, but no one came to help. People were watching, though. Curtains twitched open up and down the block. Silhouettes moved behind windows. Coffee mugs paused midair. Everyone knew Karen. And everyone knew she had finally met her match. She tried one more desperate move, accelerating forward to bully her way through the setup. But her bumper hit the edge of a ramp, lifting it just enough to tilt her tire. The whole SUV wobbled in an awkward, humiliating angle, not enough to cause damage, but enough to make her panic. She froze. Her pride had met a wall she couldn't bulldoze through. She stepped out again, this time visibly shaking with frustration. Her carefully styled hair bounced as she stomped around, inspecting the layout as though looking for a weak point she could exploit. But there wasn't one. Every cone placement, every ramp location, every inch of the racetrack had been planned with her behavior in mind. She wasn't prepared for something she couldn't argue her way out of. I remained silent, letting the moment breathe. This wasn't about confrontation. This was about clarity, finally making her understand that boundaries exist for a reason. And for once, she was the one boxed in. Eventually, she pulled out her phone. I couldn't hear her, but I knew exactly what kind of call she was making. The frantic gestures, the pointing at the ground, the furious pacing back and forth, she was trying to report me. Or complain. Or demand someone come fix the situation she created herself. But no one came. Minutes passed. Then 10. Then 15. She checked her phone repeatedly, her frustration turning into humiliation. This time, the world wasn't jumping to her rescue. Finally, she climbed back inside the SUV and started the slow, uncomfortable process of untangling herself from the course. It took several minutes of awkward repositioning, bumping tires against cones, lifting the edge of a ramp accidentally, and even stepping out twice more to reevaluate. But finally, with one final frustrated jerk of the steering wheel, she managed to roll backward out of the course and onto the street. She sat there for a long moment, staring at my driveway with a mixture of defeat and disbelief. The racetrack hadn't hurt her car. Hadn't damaged her property. Hadn't crossed any legal boundaries. But it had done one thing perfectly. It had crushed her entitlement. And she knew she had lost. She sped away without a word, her SUV roaring down the street, leaving behind a driveway full of cones, ramps, and victory. The neighborhood seemed quieter after Karen's humiliating retreat, but the tension in the air was palpable. The morning sunlight reflected off the cones and ramps left scattered across the driveway, reminders of the small, perfect chaos I had orchestrated. Even as the street returned to its usual hum, I could feel the invisible ripple of my actions, whispers from neighbors, curious glances from passing cars, and the subtle relief of finally asserting boundaries. Karen's SUV had vanished around the corner, yet the impact of her defeat lingered. I stepped outside to inspect the setup, moving cones and ramps back to their storage, taking note of each piece and how effectively it had funneled her into the miniature racetrack. The careful positioning of every object had worked flawlessly, her overconfidence had met meticulous planning, and the result was more satisfying than I had imagined. This was the culmination of weeks of strategy, observation, and patience. She had underestimated me, and now everyone who witnessed the aftermath had to acknowledge it. Walking through the driveway, I noticed the subtle marks left by her tires. The slight scuffs on the asphalt weren't damaging, but they documented the path of her struggle, a silent proof of her entanglement in my design. I paused to trace the tire marks with my foot, imagining her every motion, every panic-driven decision. There was a strange artistry to it, the way her large vehicle had maneuvered, tipped, and pressed against obstacles she hadn't even noticed at first. Every misstep told a story, and every story reinforced the simple truth: arrogance cannot overcome preparation. I could hear murmurs from the neighboring houses. People peeked from behind curtains, sneaking glances at my driveway while trying to appear casual. I knew some were smiling, others were laughing quietly to themselves, and a few were shaking their heads in disbelief. The spectacle had become a quiet neighborhood event, a shared moment of poetic justice that didn't involve confrontation, shouting, or damage. It had happened perfectly and silently, leaving only a memory and a lesson. Karen, on the other hand, wasn't going to forget. I had a sense she was already fuming, possibly calling friends, relatives, or even the HOA office to complain. But the beauty of my plan lay in its subtlety. No laws were broken. No property was damaged. No rules were bent. I had merely used creativity, observation, and patience to assert my rights. She could rage, she could report, but she couldn't reverse what had happened, and she couldn't ignore the message. By mid-morning, I had cleared the driveway entirely, putting the cones and ramps away neatly in the garage. I stood back for a moment, taking in the calm street. It seemed ordinary now, peaceful again, but I knew the dynamic had shifted. Karen had challenged my boundaries one too many times, and I had responded in a way she couldn't ignore or trivialize. This small, clever maneuver had reminded her, the HOA, and the neighborhood that I wasn't someone to be trifled with. As the day progressed, I observed from inside my home. A few neighbors even stopped by under the pretense of casual conversation, sneaking subtle questions about the setup. Their curiosity was clear, but so was their admiration. It was as if everyone understood the satisfaction of seeing entitlement meet clever resistance. Each visitor left with a subtle grin, a nod of approval, and perhaps a story to share later. The neighborhood had witnessed a small yet significant victory without any confrontation or loud argument. Later in the afternoon, I noticed Karen's SUV slowly creeping down the street, pausing at the end of my driveway. Her expression was unreadable through the tinted windows, but I could sense her frustration simmering beneath the surface. She circled once, then twice, before finally driving off again, muttering under her breath. She didn't attempt to park in my spot. She didn't honk or gesture angrily. For the first time, she had to pause, evaluate, and acknowledge defeat silently. The rest of the day was filled with a quiet satisfaction. I spent time tending to my garden and enjoying the peace of the reclaimed driveway. The cones and ramps were stored, yet the memory of their effectiveness lingered. I knew that this would not only deter Karen from future antics but also serve as a warning to anyone else tempted to overstep boundaries in my neighborhood. Strategic patience and clever thinking had won the day. By evening, as the sun dipped behind the rooftops, casting long shadows across the street, I felt a deep sense of accomplishment. It wasn't just about the parking spot anymore. It was about respect, about asserting one's rights, and about demonstrating that arrogance could be countered without aggression. The message had been sent, and the neighborhood had seen it unfold quietly yet effectively. That night, I finally allowed myself to relax. Karen's SUV was gone. The driveway was calm. And yet, I knew that the lessons learned today would echo for weeks, perhaps months. Every glance from a neighbor, every whispered conversation, and every private acknowledgement of my cleverness reinforced the simple truth: careful planning, patience, and a little creativity can overcome even the most entitled adversaries. The day ended as it had begun, peacefully. But the quiet satisfaction of victory was more powerful than any loud confrontation ever could be. Karen had tested me. I had responded. And in the subtle drama of a suburban street, justice had quietly prevailed. The morning after Karen's defeat dawned calm and unassuming, yet beneath the surface, the neighborhood had shifted. Word traveled faster than any official announcement, carried by glances, whispers, and the occasional door left slightly ajar. Neighbors who had previously ignored petty disputes now peeked from behind curtains, their eyes following every movement on my driveway with curiosity and quiet satisfaction. Even the kids walking to school pointed, whispering to each other about the mysterious racetrack incident that had left Karen humiliated the day before. I stepped outside to inspect my driveway once again, cones and ramps long gone back into storage, leaving nothing but a clean stretch of asphalt. On the surface, it looked ordinary. Yet the memory of yesterday's events lingered in the air, palpable in the subtle tension radiating from the houses around me. It wasn't just Karen who had been affected, the entire street now acknowledged the quiet assertion of boundaries and ingenuity. I could feel their admiration, their curiosity, and, in some cases, their amusement. From behind the blinds of her house, I could see Karen moving. She wasn't angry in the chaotic, irrational way one might expect. Instead, she was calculating, pacing back and forth, her hands clasped behind her head as she surveyed the quiet street. The defeat of her SUV in my clever obstacle course had clearly triggered something deeper than mere frustration. Her pride had been wounded, and wounded pride is often the most dangerous. She spent hours making notes on a clipboard, sketching layouts, and possibly planning how to regain her perceived dominance. Despite the calm exterior of the neighborhood, the tension was undeniable. Conversations between neighbors became laced with subtle excitement, each discussion circling back to the morning's events. Who would have thought a simple driveway could turn into a stage for such drama? Whispers filled the air. Did you see what he did? I can't believe she got stuck. It was genius. Some neighbors even admitted quietly that they had wanted to intervene but lacked the creativity and patience to execute a plan with such precision. As the day progressed, I began observing Karen's behavior more closely. She circled the block several times, clearly debating whether to test the driveway again. I could see her lips moving, likely muttering curses under her breath. She paused repeatedly, glancing at her SUV parked neatly in her own driveway, as though deciding if the humiliation from yesterday could be mitigated or avenged. But something in her body language told me she wasn't ready yet. She was calculating, planning, and plotting, an opponent who refused to surrender but had temporarily acknowledged defeat. Meanwhile, my own routine returned to normal. I watered my garden, trimmed the hedges, and enjoyed the satisfaction of finally having my space respected. Yet, I remained vigilant. Karen was not the type to forget, and the faint tension that her presence always brought remained. Every time a car drove down the street or a neighbor stepped outside, I instinctively checked for signs of her approach. Preparation had won yesterday, but the narrative was far from over. By late afternoon, a few neighbors stopped by under the guise of casual conversation. Their smiles were subtle, their questions pointed. So, did she try to park again? I saw her SUV staring at your driveway this morning. You handled that perfectly. These interactions reminded me that the impact of my actions extended beyond just Karen. The neighborhood had witnessed a small but significant assertion of control and fairness. People understood the satisfaction of seeing entitlement meet clever resistance, and many subtly expressed approval through quiet nods, knowing the street had just been made a little more just. Despite the neighborhood's quiet support, I knew Karen wasn't finished. Her pacing, muttering, and note-taking indicated that she was already strategizing for a comeback. Perhaps she would try to circumvent the driveway, find a loophole, or, more likely, create her own scheme to assert dominance. I couldn't underestimate her. Experience taught me that someone with her level of arrogance and persistence often escalates when confronted. The challenge wasn't merely to reclaim a parking spot, it was to anticipate her next move, to stay 2 steps ahead, and to maintain control over a situation that could quickly spiral. Evening arrived with a warm orange glow, casting long shadows across the neighborhood. Karen's SUV had vanished temporarily, likely for a planning session, leaving the street quiet once more. I stood at my front door, looking at the familiar stretch of asphalt, and considered the days ahead. The racetrack had served its purpose perfectly, she had been humbled, and her overconfidence had been exposed. But the story was far from over. In her mind, defeat was temporary, and she would undoubtedly seek ways to challenge me again. The mental chess game had only just begun. As I retreated inside, the quiet of the house reminded me of the stakes at hand. This was no longer just about a parking spot. It had become a test of patience, creativity, and anticipation. Each day offered a potential new move from Karen, and I needed to remain vigilant. Even the simplest decisions, watering the lawn, moving the trash bins, or stepping outside to collect the mail, were observed through the lens of strategy. I had to anticipate every angle, every potential action, and every minor escalation she might attempt. That night, I reviewed my plan again. I didn't need to modify the driveway immediately. The obstacle course had served its purpose for now. But I considered subtle improvements, removable markers, camouflaged cones, and mental traps that could be activated if she tried to test my boundaries again. Preparation was everything. One misstep, one moment of underestimation, could allow her to regain control. I was determined not to give her that chance. By the time I finally turned off the lights, the street outside was silent. Yet the anticipation lingered. Karen's plotting, the neighborhood's curiosity, and my own vigilance created an undercurrent of tension that seemed to pulse through every house on the block. This wasn't just a minor feud anymore, it was a narrative unfolding in real time, a battle of wits, patience, and creativity. And tomorrow, when the sun rose again, we would continue the game, each move measured, each response calculated. The stakes had changed. What began as a simple dispute over a parking spot had grown into a subtle war of strategy, observation, and psychological maneuvering. Karen's arrogance had been checked, but it had not disappeared. My victory had set the stage, but the story was far from complete. The next chapter of this suburban saga promised escalation, anticipation, and perhaps more clever surprises that would leave the neighborhood watching in awe. The morning air carried a faint chill, unusual for this time of year, as if the universe itself sensed the tension about to unfold. The neighborhood, now fully awake, seemed to hold its breath. Yesterday's events, the racetrack incident, had left ripples of curiosity, amusement, and subtle admiration running through every street corner and backyard. Everyone remembered Karen's humiliation, but they also knew that a storm was brewing. She would not accept defeat lightly. I had spent the night reviewing every angle, every possible move she might take. My driveway was now quiet, pristine, ordinary to the casual observer. But I knew better. Every line, every space, every inch had been mapped in my mind. Preparation wasn't just a word, it was my strategy, my shield, and my advantage. And yet, I couldn't ignore the knowledge that Karen was a persistent adversary. She was planning something more audacious than mere parking defiance. By mid-morning, subtle signs indicated her return. First, the slow hum of her SUV, muffled by the distance but unmistakable. Then, the telltale glint of pink and white as she stepped from the vehicle, clipboard in hand, pacing carefully. Her posture was calculated, deliberate, but her eyes burned with quiet determination. Yesterday's defeat had not broken her, it had transformed her frustration into focus. She circled my driveway multiple times, inspecting the edges, the spacing, the potential weak points. I watched from my window, heart steady but mind alert. This wasn't just a parking spot anymore. This was a psychological duel, a test of wit, patience, and anticipation. Each of her steps, each movement of the clipboard, each calculated glance, told a story of planning, of preparation, of strategy. She wasn't rushing. She was patient. And patience can be dangerous in the wrong hands. Suddenly, she pulled out a measuring tape. My stomach tightened slightly. She wasn't just observing, she was taking notes, calculating angles, distances, and potential leverage points. Her SUV remained stationary, yet she moved with precision, marking spots on her clipboard as if creating a blueprint of my territory. It was an escalation. She was turning yesterday's defeat into tomorrow's advantage. The neighborhood's attention intensified. Windows opened subtly, doors cracked, and whispered conversations resumed. Some neighbors were curious, some amused, and a few apprehensive. Karen had a reputation, and now she was attempting something more ambitious than anyone had seen. The anticipation in the air was electric, and I could sense the subtle thrill of the unknown spreading through the block. By afternoon, she had returned to her vehicle, clipboard in hand, and started a slow, deliberate drive along the street, repeatedly stopping to note measurements, angles, and potential entries. She moved like a general preparing a battlefield, and my mind raced with countermeasures. Every possible maneuver I had envisioned the night before suddenly became real considerations. Her focus was unmatched, her attention to detail precise. This was no longer a casual feud, it was a fully fledged tactical operation. I decided to respond subtly. Without drawing attention, I adjusted minor elements in the driveway, moving a potted plant slightly, reorienting the mailbox, shifting a small garden ornament. These minor changes would not be noticeable to anyone but could disrupt her calculations. Every action I took was deliberate, intentional, and meant to assert control without confrontation. Strategy, I reminded myself, always wins over brute force. As the day wore on, she paused, stepping out of the SUV to reevaluate her approach. I observed her from the window, noticing how she traced imaginary lines with her hands, recalculating angles, imagining maneuvers. Her frustration was building, but so was her ingenuity. The quiet tension of the neighborhood was almost tangible. People walking by slowed, glancing at her and then at me, sensing the drama unfolding. Some whispered about taking sides, others merely watched, captivated by the silent spectacle. By late afternoon, Karen began to execute her plan. Small cones appeared at the edge of my driveway, unfamiliar objects that weren't part of my layout. Her SUV slowly maneuvered closer, testing the boundaries I had carefully established. Every inch of movement was calculated, cautious, almost like watching a chess match played with vehicles. I noted every adjustment, every pause, every turn. The air was thick with anticipation. Despite her efforts, the subtle traps I had previously set still functioned perfectly. My driveway, ordinary to the casual observer, was a field of minor obstacles invisible until activated. Every maneuver she attempted led her to pause, recalibrate, and reconsider. She was clever, relentless, and stubborn, but my preparation and patience gave me the upper hand. The day became a quiet battle of wits, where no one shouted, no one honked. Yet victory and defeat were defined in microseconds and subtle adjustments. As the sun began to dip, casting long shadows across the street, Karen's efforts reached a peak of frustration. Her measurements had been precise, her calculations meticulous, yet she could not find a loophole or weakness in my design. Her vehicle remained parked at the edge of the driveway, at a calculated distance, her hands clenched tightly around the steering wheel. I could feel the tension radiating from her, the quiet storm of irritation and determination. Finally, she stepped out, inspecting the driveway one last time. The neighborhood, fully aware of her attempts now, observed quietly from behind curtains and fences. Even children walking home from school slowed their pace, sensing the climax of the silent battle. Karen's shoulders stiffened, a subtle sign of defeat, though her eyes still burned with unspoken resolve. The confrontation was far from violent, yet the intensity of strategy and pride was palpable. By evening, she retreated to her vehicle and drove off slowly, muttering, probably plotting her next move. My driveway remained untouched, pristine, and victorious. The subtle satisfaction of triumph was almost overwhelming. The neighborhood's murmurs hinted at admiration and anticipation for what would unfold next. The silent battle had ended for the day, but the story was far from over. The quiet that followed was deceptive. I knew Karen's mind was already racing, plotting her next move. Every step I had taken to assert boundaries, every measure to reclaim control, had shifted the balance, but only temporarily. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, and I had to remain vigilant. The neighborhood had witnessed a masterclass in patience, strategy, and subtle assertion of power, but the ultimate resolution was still far away. The next morning dawned bright and clear, yet there was an unusual tension lingering in the neighborhood air. Everyone who had witnessed the ongoing feud between Karen and me was quietly anticipating the next move. The street seemed calm at first glance, but the subtle signs of unease and curiosity were everywhere. Curtains opened, car doors clicked shut with extra care, and whispered conversations floated across fences. The previous days of psychological maneuvers, silent confrontations, and clever planning had escalated into a full-blown neighborhood spectacle, and today promised the final act. I stepped outside, scanning my driveway and the surrounding area with the vigilance of a general overseeing a battlefield. Every inch of the asphalt had been carefully analyzed, every obstacle and boundary studied and perfected. The racetrack, the subtle garden adjustments, and the micro-obstacles I had implemented now formed a comprehensive strategy designed to maintain control and prevent any intrusion. Karen's previous attempts to test the driveway had been clever, persistent, and audacious, but my preparation had proven superior. Today, I anticipated her final push. As expected, Karen arrived mid-morning, her SUV glinting in the sunlight. Her stride was purposeful, clipboard in hand, but her confidence was tempered with caution. She had learned that yesterday's arrogance could not carry her forward. She paused at the street entrance, assessing the driveway, weighing her options, and calculating her next move. I watched from my window, knowing this was the decisive moment, the culmination of days of silent strategy and psychological chess. Without warning, she started her vehicle and approached the driveway, cautiously maneuvering around the minor obstacles she had noticed in previous attempts. Her tires brushed against the edges of cones I had left deliberately as reminders, subtle psychological triggers that forced her to slow, pause, and reconsider each movement. I observed her calculated precision, her hesitation, and the growing frustration building behind her eyes. She was clever, but every step she took reaffirmed my advantage. Preparation had become my weapon, patience my shield. Neighbors began to peek from their windows and doorways, sensing the climax of the ongoing saga. Whispers of admiration and curiosity rippled down the street. Some children on bicycles slowed to watch, their eyes wide with excitement. The scene had transformed from a simple parking dispute into a neighborhood event, a live demonstration of strategy, patience, and the consequences of entitlement. Every eye was fixed on Karen, every subtle movement scrutinized, as she tested my carefully laid traps once more. Karen's attempts, though audacious, began to falter. Every minor adjustment I had implemented earlier became crucial. Subtle changes in the driveway, strategic placements of minor objects, and the careful calibration of space created invisible barriers she could not circumvent. Her meticulous calculations were met with my quiet foresight, and the cumulative effect was unmistakable. She had no path to claim dominance today. Her frustration mounted, her grip tightened on the steering wheel, and the muttered curses grew louder, though no one could hear them. The neighborhood's anticipation intensified as Karen made her final approach. Each maneuver became slower, more deliberate, as if she were attempting to force a flaw in my system. But the driveway, the obstacles, and the environment I had prepared were flawless. Her SUV moved with extreme caution, yet every inch of progress revealed only the limits of her strategy. Observers could almost feel the tension emanating from the vehicle, a combination of pride, anger, and helplessness. Finally, Karen stepped out of the SUV, surveying the situation. The clipboard in her hand trembled slightly, a subtle indicator of her frustration and mental fatigue. She had exhausted every calculation, every angle, and every potential loophole. Her defeat was no longer hypothetical, it was tangible, undeniable, and public. The neighborhood watched quietly, the tension now replaced by subtle admiration for the clever execution of a simple yet perfect strategy. I emerged from my home at that moment, casually walking toward the driveway. My posture was relaxed, but my mind was fully alert. The subtle shift in the street's dynamic was palpable. Karen's shoulders stiffened as she noticed my presence, her eyes darting between me and the driveway, realizing fully that her options had run out. The psychological advantage had shifted decisively. I had controlled the narrative, the environment, and the outcome without raising my voice, breaking the law, or creating any physical confrontation. She returned to her vehicle slowly, muttering under her breath, and finally drove away, her energy spent and her pride significantly diminished. The neighborhood exhaled collectively, the tension dissipating into a quiet satisfaction. People stepped outside, offering subtle nods and smiles of acknowledgement, their curiosity replaced by admiration for the quiet yet absolute resolution of the conflict. The victory wasn't merely about a parking spot anymore, it was about respect, strategic thinking, and maintaining boundaries. The driveway was restored to its calm, pristine state, but the story lingered. Neighbors shared their observations, kids recounted the events excitedly, and Karen's absence from my immediate sphere became a symbol of the effectiveness of patience, creativity, and preparation. By evening, as the sun cast golden hues across the street, I reflected on the entire sequence of events. Karen had been persistent, clever, and determined, yet every step she had taken was anticipated, every calculation countered, and every maneuver rendered ineffective. The outcome was clear: strategic foresight and preparation always outmatch unchecked arrogance. The silent, non-confrontational battle had reached its climax, and I had emerged victorious. As night fell, I took one last walk down the driveway, ensuring everything was in order. The subtle impressions of tires and footsteps remained, faint reminders of the contest that had unfolded over days. The street, now quiet and calm, bore the mark of a lesson learned. Karen had tested boundaries, and those boundaries had been enforced, not with anger, but with cleverness, patience, and resolve. The neighborhood, once merely a backdrop to mundane suburban life, had witnessed a masterclass in subtle strategy. Conversations, whispers, and nods of approval confirmed the universal understanding of what had transpired. This was more than a feud, it was a demonstration that entitlement can be countered with creativity, patience, and foresight. The final outcome left everyone in no doubt. Karen would reconsider her actions, the neighborhood had learned a quiet but powerful lesson, and I had solidified control over my domain. The driveway, now ordinary in appearance, had become a symbol of strategy, vigilance, and clever resistance. Victory had been achieved without confrontation, loud arguments, or destruction, proof that preparation and intelligence prevail over arrogance and entitlement. And as I locked the front door, the quiet satisfaction of a hard-earned victory settled over me. The street remained peaceful, the neighborhood intrigued but reassured, and the story, now complete, became another whispered legend in the chronicles of suburban justice. If you haven't subscribed yet, make sure to hit that button to follow the story and witness more unbelievable HOA drama unfold right here.